Some faced hell itself for freedom's dream. Let freedom ring wherever minds know what it means to be in chains. Let freedom ring wherever hearts know pain. Let freedom go through the lonely streets where prisons have no key. You can be free and you can sing. Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring. God built freedom into every fiber of creation, and He meant for us to all be free and whole. Free and whole. But when my God bought freedom with the blood of His redemption, His cross still parted up by the side. I'll sing it out with every breath. I'll let the whole world hear it. This hallelujah anthem of the free. That I'm far and heavy chains can never hold us captive. The sun has made us free and free indeed. Let freedom ring down through the ages from a hill called Calvary. Let freedom ring wherever hearts know pain. Let freedom echo through the lonely streets where prisons have no key. You can be free and you can sing. Let freedom ring. Let freedom echo through the lonely streets where prisons have no key. You can be free and you can sing. Let freedom ring. You can be free and you can sing. Let freedom ring. Let freedom The Cavaliers, you guys were great. I believe they may have heard that all the way to Washington. You know? Yeah, let's hope. Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce a man I'm happy to call friend, a great historian, a great speaker. You've heard part of his introduction. Welcome, Steve Pearson.
Before I start, I'd like to mention my dad, Staff Sergeant Alton Pearson. He was a World War II vet that's not with me anymore. I'm going to take you back in history for a few minutes. I'm actually going to take you all the way back to some 235 years, to 1775. I'll tell you, before there was liberty to preserve, it had to be gained in the first place. And I'm going to talk about those guys. I want to take you to a specific date. This date is June the 15th, 1775. The location is Watertown, Massachusetts, a small town outside of Boston. There, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress is meeting, and it's been organized because when the British invaded Boston, they disorganized the Massachusetts legislature, and this group was put in place to manage colonial affairs. It's only been about 2 months since the skirmish at Lexington and Concord. At that time, General Gage had been essentially moving into the countryside to disarm folks, and he learned that there was a large collection of weapons in Concord, so he devised a secret raid. They would get prepared on April the 18th, 1775, and then they would move out and be moving early in the morning on the 19th, and that's what they did. They built flat-bottom boats in Boston to row across the Charles River to the Charlestown Peninsula, and from there they would move on to Lexington and then to Concord. When they started moving that morning, everything went fine. When they arrived in Lexington, they found militia standing on the green, and a standoff ensued, and a shot was fired. It was that shot heard around the world. 8 Americans died that day. 10 were wounded. Only 1 British minor injury, and the commander of the unit moved on to Concord to finish his mission. When he arrived in Concord, he really didn't find anything, but he got into a skirmish along the North Bridge and took some casualties of his own, and decided his mission was over with. He needed to move back to Charlestown and to Boston. And on the way back, those Minutemen came out of the woods. They hid behind trees, behind stone walls and fences, and they started picking them off, one by one. By the time the British returned to Charlestown, they'd lost 300 casualties, wounded, dead, and captured. And they were lucky to get back into Boston. But for the 2 months as I work up to June the 15th, they had been reinforcing themselves, adding more and more troops, and had also gotten 3 generals from England, 3 of the finest field commanders the British had. There was General William Howe, General John Burgoyne, and General Henry Clinton. And they were planning to invade Massachusetts. Back in Watertown, the Provincial Congress was meeting, and the president of that Congress was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Warren was also the chairman of the Committee of Safety. That was the committee responsible for protecting the rest of Massachusetts. He was also chairman of the Committee of Correspondence, and his job was to communicate with the other colonies to let them know what was going on. And he'd also just been elected a major general of the Massachusetts militia. You might just say Dr. Warren was everything. And the truth of the matter, he was. He was at Harvard educated. He was a medical doctor. He was tall. The books say he was handsome. He was certainly distinguished. Had all the qualities of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, before we had George Washington, we had Dr. Joseph Warren. But the day was gloomy. He had just learned that the British were expected to move out on June the 18th, just 3 days hence, and come into the countryside after the militia. Let me tell you a little bit about the terrain around Boston before I go further. Boston's almost like an island. It's connected to the mainland by a small neck. And right at that neck is a hill called Gloucester Heights. There's also another peninsula to the north of Boston. It looks a lot like it. It also is like an island. A small neck of land that connects it to the mainland. And there's a hill on the Charlestown Peninsula called Bunker Hill. General Isaac Putnam had been trying to get Dr. Warren to occupy Bunker Hill for some time. Move some cannon up to this hill, and there they would be able to fire on the city. Dr. Warren didn't want to do that for two reasons. One was he was in communications with Gage, trying to find some way to cool things down, not let them go any further. And he was also worried. He had militia. He had ordinary people, like so many, to stand up against the best equipped, best trained, best led army in the world, backed up by the most powerful navy in the world. He didn't think he could do it. But after learning this information, he had no choice. He had to move quicker than Gage would be able to move. So he gave an order. And that order was to occupy Gloucester Heights and Bunker Hill. An order went out. And he had two generals, one to the north and one to the south. The north was General Artemus Ward at Cambridge. And to the south, General John Thomas at Roxbury. When General John Thomas got the order, he could not move. He said, I don't have the men. I don't have the weapons. If I move up there, I'll just lose. I'm going to stay entrenched to where I am. Artemus Ward had just the opposite. He said, we can do it, and we'll move out. And he selected his lieutenant colonel. His Warner Holt was Thomas Prescott, and he couldn't have chosen any better. The next morning on June 16th, Prescott began to organize his operation. And by that afternoon at 7 o'clock, he was ready to move out under cover of darkness. He had 1,500 men. A prayer was said there at Harvard College as they moved out some 3.5 miles to cross over the Charlestown Neck. Once they got there, they stopped. General Putnam, Colonel Prescott, and the engineer who was with them, Richard Gridley, went up on the hill. They were going to lay out a redoubt, which is an earthen fort. And for whatever reason, no one seems to know, either by argument, by discussion, or just didn't understand the orders. They chose a hill just a little bit further down toward Charlestown, which is Breed's Hill, instead of Bunker Hill. When they had laid out the redoubt, Colonel Prescott came back down, he got his troops, and he headed up to start their digging. He had raw individuals. He didn't have soldiers. They hardly knew how to use a musket, but one thing they did know how to use was a shovel. And they started digging. Colonel Prescott pushed them hard. He said, don't make any noise. We can't let them know we're here. And they dug through the night. They pushed hard, no breaks. And in the early morning, when Prescott could barely see, he noticed he had a weakness to his left. And so he moved some of his soldiers off to build a breastwork, to reinforce a fence. And another general, one from New Hampshire, Stark, came up with 200 volunteers and went all the way down to the Mystic River. And he started fortifying there. Somebody else woke up that morning. That was a watch on board a British ship. He saw what was going on Bunker Hill. And he woke the captain. The captain fired a shot out of his cannon to awaken the British High Command in Boston. General Gage, when he woke up and he looked out and could see what was going on, he called a meeting of his generals. They met starting at about 7 o'clock that morning. Also about that time, the British Navy was in full gear. They pulled anchor and swung around, and they started bombarding the hill. But it was mostly ineffective because the hill was much higher than the naval guns could elevate. But cannonballs can bounce around. Sometime in the morning, one of those balls did hit an individual. His name was Asa Pollard. He was the first casualty in that operation. And it couldn't have been a more grisly sight because it took his head off. It decapitated him. You can imagine the sight, especially if you're folks that have never endured the receiving end of artillery, and then to see the ghastly results of what war can be. Through the day, people started to leave. In order to encourage folks, Colonel Prescott got up on the parapet at the very top of the redoubt. He walked along the top, encouraging some people to dig, trying to build confidence. I'm sure he impressed some, but some others left. In any case, back in Boston, the British Army was ready to move. It took them longer than normal, but by 9 o'clock they'd made up their mind what they were going to do. General Howe was going to command the force. That force was going to essentially just a frontal attack onto the rebel positions. He would take